Okay. Hi, everyone. So as introduced, I'll be talking about creating a sustainable supply chain in the network industry and specifically addressing the Scope 3 category. So sustainability has been a topic for quite some time now, but it always improves. There's new policies, new regulations, and there's always a new stage that companies reach when it comes to becoming or being sustainable. So in this presentation, I'll cover some of the learnings that we as a company have. There's unfortunately no magic trick, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know a few more steps and ways to address your supply chain footprint. So first, I'll be covering the relevance. So why is this important for us? Some of the footprint categories to also specify what Scope 3 is. Some industry-wide initiatives, so what exactly is happening, and what are the challenges with Scope 3, and some practical approaches at the very end, how we can address these challenges and what we can do. So first of all, it's quite relevant that we're focusing on this and focusing on footprint and measurements. First of all, because our industry has a large global footprint, but also we have a high growth rate. So already in 2020, which is like mid-COVID, pre-COVID, the global footprint was 763 millions of tons of CO2 equivalent. And this is predicted to be growing by 2030 to 830 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which might not seem too large, but we're talking about millions, so it is quite large. And at the moment, our global footprint, the industry's global footprint is 2%, which is actually very similar to what the footprint for the aviation industry is. So this is also not a little part. And there are some projections that say that if we do not change anything and just have the improvements and growth of the industry on its own without any reductions, globally this industry can take up 14% of the global footprint by 2040, which is quite a big growth. This doesn't have to happen. This is just showcasing that how much we can actually do, and there's room for improvement, and that we can actually make a global impact as an industry. Yes, so let's talk about scopes and breaking down emissions. So scopes are emission categories defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You might have heard about them, but if not, then I'm going to introduce them. So there's scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is everything that's the direct emission of your organization. So if you have offices or company cars, everything that goes into this category. Scope 2 is everything that's energy purchase. So if you charge an electric vehicle, that will go into this category. But also if you purchase electricity for your data center, that's also in this category. So every energy that you purchase will be covered by this. And then Scope 3 is technically everything else. So it's the entire supply chain. And these are all indirect emissions that affect your company. And so every time you buy products, services, or anything else that is part of your supply chain, this is the category that it goes to. To elaborate a bit more on the complexity of this scope, because as you assumed, the supply chain is a pretty big part of our footprint. Scope 3 even has 15 subcategories. So everything that's blue above, that's Scope 3. And with 15 subcategories, there's upstream and downstream activities. And you see that Scope 1 and 2 is much more simpler, less categories, more straightforward. So it is worth to focus on this category. And just to bring up a few examples, so this is statistics from 2020. According to CDP, this is a platform where companies can submit their footprint and sustainability goals and details. And as you can see, Scope 1 and 2 is orange and green. And while you cannot see that much orange and green on this photo, Scope 3 is taking up a really large amount of a lot of companies' emissions. So you can see that some of it is smaller, some of it is bigger. This probably changed in the last couple of years. But one thing is pretty obvious, that despite the size of the whole emission, Scope 3 is a really big part of it. And just to have a bit more closer, so Scope 1, 2, and 3 was a bit more high level, but this is what exactly is covered in our industry when we're talking about this. So as I mentioned, Scope 1 is more vehicles, offices, and Scope 2, so don't let that fool you, that's still energy, but energy that is going into these categories. So electricity for amplifiers, for POPs, for partner data centers, and so on. And then the biggest chunk, so as you can see, Scope 3 is 85% on average. So this will change company per company, but the statistic shows that this is for most companies between 70 and 100% of emissions. And it brings the average to 85. The biggest part is network equipment, the network construction, downstream leased assets, so purchasing IP transit or other services. And also, there's a big part that's covered with operating the network, employees, and upstream transportation as well. And yes, just as the highlight also shows, that on average, Scope 3, or the footprint of the supply chain, is 26 times greater than the corporation's own operational emissions. And this is crucial because every company has direct influence over own operational emissions, but the supply chain is something harder to tackle. So what's going on in the industry? So there are some developments. There's been some regulations recently. There's always new ones, new standards coming in, new regulations. And for example, the CSRD incentivized a lot of companies to start to measure their footprints because it became obligatory to report on footprints. This is something ongoing, so the bigger companies are already impacted, who have more than 500 employees. But by the end of 2028, this will cover even SMEs. So you will have to measure your footprint. Some of you, as I said, already do. But the industry together collaboratively agreed to a greenhouse gas emission reduction of 45% between 2020 and 2030. This is in line with the Paris Agreement as well, which is also shown by that there are some agreements on how to reach science-based targets, how to develop the science-based pathway for the industry. So not just generally, but industry-specific developments are also made on how to reach net zero emissions. And here it's important to think about that here 45% is the number. So to keep on track with these goals and targets, companies pledge to reduce 45%. But then if you remember that the supply chain on average is 85%, this reduction can only be made if you also focus on your supply chain and Scope 3. It's not possible to reduce your footprint 45% if you're only reducing Scope 1 and 2, which a lot of companies are doing right now. However, there's a reason why Scope 3 is harder to tackle, because there's a lot of challenges. Three of the main challenges are complexity. So as I've shown in the previous slides, there's a lot of subcategories, there's a lot of there's standardization missing, and you have to work a lot. It's very time-consuming. There's also a lack of control. You do not have direct control over your suppliers, so you can try to incentivize them, but every partner in your supply chain has its own processes, organization, agenda, goals, measures that they're taking, which sometimes it's pretty challenging to align with your own goals. And then there's data quality issues. So first of all, there's a lot of data. How do you organize it? How do you collect it? What can you do? But there's not only a lot of data, there's also a little data in another sense. A lot of smaller companies do not have the resources or do not have the capacity and time to actually measure these or actually have a look at these. So There's a few challenges. However, there are a few approaches that I'll be covering that you can actually take as steps and try to tackle this. So if you look at the slide, you will see under some of the categories a little green tick. That means that Interlink is focusing or currently prioritizing these topics. That doesn't mean that the other topics are not equally important or you shouldn't do those. It just means that right now, based on our sustainability journey, these are the topics where we have more experience in and where we've been taking several steps to make sure that we're on the right track. So what you can actually do, I'll be listing 6 categories and go into detail into 2. Yeah, the first one is to prioritize measurement and data collection. It's understandable that you cannot do anything as long as you know your data, you know your supply chain. So first of all, not too exciting, but you have to collect your data. You have to see your measurements. You have to see where your hotspots are. Who are your highlighted suppliers? They might be only a few where you can already make a big impact. Are there any low-hanging fruits? Can you collaborate with someone? But for that, you really need to map your supply chain and its emissions. So wherever it's possible, you can reach out to your suppliers. You can collect life cycle assessments, and this is a point I'll be going into more detail in the next slide. And next to this, you can also engage and support suppliers. What this means, you can establish partnerships. So if you know there's another company that has the same goal, you can negotiate together with an electricity supplier, for example. You can create partnerships. You can collaborate on building data centers. You can collaborate on investing into offset programs. There are so many possibilities. Every company is different. You have to figure it out for yourself. Who's the best partner for this? Where do you see the developments? Where do you want to go? And then find, because if there are more companies collaborating, you also have more power and bigger steps that you can take. And then there's also implementing sustainable procurement practices. Actually, quite a few companies are already doing this. So this is to select your suppliers in a way that they align with your environmentally responsible environmental goals. And for this, you can develop supplier scorecards. This is also depending on company preferences, and you have to decide what are the measurements you want to collect. You can look at electricity, you can look at targets, you can look at product components, you can look at a lot of different things. There's no one fits for all. This is something that it's also worth to sit down and see what data am I interested in to get from my suppliers. Because if you overload the data, then you might miss the point of collecting this information. And then based on the supplier scorecards, you can decide which supplier you prefer. Because, for example, if you're offsetting your emissions, that also costs something. So there might be a cheaper supplier, but then if you add that cost on top of that later, that means that choosing another supplier that's more sustainable might be actually much more worth for you on the long term. So these are decision factors that you can implement into your purchasing practices. And so yeah, what data can I actually collect from my suppliers? Well, a lot, but in our experience, these are the main categories that are actually beneficial, and they're also enough to create a map of your supply chain. So one of them is invoices. I hope everyone is collecting this already. But this is actually a really good starting point. So even if you don't reach out to your suppliers, with this, you can already make some estimations. And this method is called spend-based estimations. This is working with emission factors. And the only negative part of it is that this is working with industry averages. This is still pretty accurate. But at the same time, your emissions might be lower if you ask it from the supplier. They have their own calculations, or higher. For us, we've seen both of the cases. So if you reach out to the suppliers, you will obviously get more accurate data, but this is actually also pretty reliable. But the next categories are everything else that you can go to your supplier and actually collect this. And this will make your estimations more specific and more punctual. So one of them is service level footprint. So for example, a service that you're consuming, what is the footprint of that? This is the most complex of all because there's no standards for this. There's a few companies who already calculate this and can provide this, but it's still pretty difficult to go down to what is the service use of a customer and what's the footprint of this, because you will know your company level data. But so if you can get this, that's really, really good from your supplier. It's always worth asking. They might already have this. Next to this, you can always collect the targets and goals. This can be the first line. Are goals aligned or not? Are we going to the same direction? And next to this also, you can always ask for electricity use. Are they using renewable energy or not? And then here, as the screenshot also shows, there's an example of a life cycle assessment. This is showing the life cycle of a product. So from the very start, from the materials, producing it, and then using it as a customer, and at the very end, kind of the death. So life and birth and death of a product. What's the footprint of its life cycle? Or it can also be like a product life cycle assessment. This you can collect when you're talking about physical products. So in this case, a phone. And I brought this screenshot as an example from Apple because they actually have these reports on their website and you can openly access this, which means that every phone your company buys, every laptop, in case Apple is one of your suppliers, this is accessible. It's not the case for every supplier, so we have other suppliers who do provide this, but you might not find it on their website because this is more specific to client use or some of the requirements that you ask. I included the one that can be found open sourced. But it's always important to ask because a lot of companies already have this. So here you can see how much is the footprint of actually buying a phone. And yes, so 3 more steps that one can do. Establish contractual clauses for sustainability. This is becoming more and more popular as well because this is a way to set specific terms and to really make sure that it's a targeted approach. So it's not a high-level approach, it's supplier-specific, and you can always discuss what are the steps that we can do together to reduce the footprint. So this is way more targeted. And this can include a lot of things. I have an additional slide about this where I'll be going into more details because here the options are also not too limited, so you can come up with various ways that fits your organization. Then promoting circular economy practices. This is more important for companies who produce products because in these cases, already the designing process is an important step to make a product more reusable, recyclable, and to promote a longer life cycle or a lower electricity use. So there's many ways that you can check or design your products that are more environmentally friendly. And there are also several companies already who have reuse and recycle programs. So if you have your hardware lying around and it's not working anymore, then I encourage everyone to really look if the company or their supplier has a recycle program because this is a very environmentally friendly way. And also collaborate across the industry. So you can always share the best practices and strategies. This is an industry effort. Although companies individually work towards their goals, as I mentioned, Scope 3 is the supply chain. So it's a lot of participants. So you can always share best practices, go to conferences, organize webinars, join forums. And for example, there's a forum also happening on the 10th of December. It's the Telco Sustainability Forum, where you can, if you're curious, it's an online webinar where you can collect tips and tricks for becoming or your road towards net zero. And there's a lot of sources like this. So if you're curious, just look around and you'll most likely find some resources that can benefit you or you can learn more things. And yes, so a bit more detail about contractual clauses. So even if your company doesn't have a legal department, that's still fine, because these screenshots, for example, are from a nonprofit organization's website. They're called Chancery Lane, and they have a lot of clauses and cases prepared on their website already. So this is, you don't have to be a legal guru for this. There's a lot of open source resources for this. And in this case, I took the example of the green IT and green hardware clause, because there's a new regulation in Germany that affects electricity usage and efficiency. So I thought this would be a great example to put up there. But this is just a few examples. This is an average use case. Everyone can use this, but you can always modify this to what you think is better for you. So in this case, this really focuses on how the company should strive for becoming more energy efficient. There's a focus on renewable energy sources, and there's also on recycling and waste reduction, but also monitoring and reporting. So you can ask your suppliers to, it doesn't have to be like super big or super scary, just ask them to give you annually a report on the sustainability practices and goals and progress that they're making. They might already have something on their website, but also you can ask to give more tailored data that's relevant for your company. Also, you can ask them to use renewable energy sources. A lot of the data centers already do, but this is just also ensuring that in the future this will continue, or if they don't, then that you know that while you have this partnership, you will continue to have renewable energy in this data center. And also set targets for emission reduction. So as I said, there's service level footprint and there's a product level footprint. So you can always ask, are you planning to reduce this footprint? Is this going to be the same? What are you doing? Can we work towards a goal? Because this will benefit my company, but also it benefits the supplier, because most sustainability initiatives have a cost return on the long term, because you save resources, time, and so on. And yes, so you can also include waste reduction commitments. And yes, so with this, I would like to close the presentation with the key takeaway, which in my opinion is collaboration is key. As you've seen, supply chain takes up a lot of part of the emissions and footprint, which means that this is an industry initiative. This is a collaborative approach with which we can reduce your footprint. And reducing your own emissions actually reduces the footprint of all your clientele. So once you start reducing your footprint, all your clients benefit from this, which means all the industry benefits from this. Because if you're talking to your suppliers and they're making the reductions, then this will have a trickle-down effect across the whole industry. So it's an industry-wide benefit for everyone working towards this. And additionally, after scope 1 and 2 reductions, there is a point beyond which you cannot reduce your footprints if you're not dealing with your supply chain and the emissions coming from the supply chain, which means that, as I already mentioned, it is a collaborative approach that the industry needs to take to actually tackle the emissions industry-wide. And with this, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also happy to discuss any of the topics outside of the auditorium. And yeah, let's tackle this together.